All right, welcome to this explainer. If you're in the middle of your university years or maybe you're just stepping into young adulthood and you're trying to figure out what it actually means to follow Christ in today's crazy modern world, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we are not doing a superficial flyby overview. No, we are conducting an exhaustive, academically rigorous forensic audit of what the primary text actually say about being a New Covenant disciple. We're going to strip away all those centuries of cultural baggage, the institutional traditions, and especially that modern consumerism mindset. And we're going to look strictly at the texts themselves. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's dive into this dossier to uncover what is actually demanded of us.
Here's the syllabus for our scholarly deep dive into the first-century realities of discipleship. We'll start by defining the core identity, look at surrendering autonomy, deconstruct the modern loophole fallacy, examine the evidentiary proofs, and finally, analyze the social cost and the absolute mandate for replication.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, defining the disciple identity. We really have to start right here because, as modern listeners, our whole idea of what a student is fundamentally distorts our reading of the ancient texts. Think about it. Today, a student is basically a passive consumer of information, right? You sit in a lecture hall, you take some notes, you cram for a test, and you move on. But let's look at the lexical definition of the Greek term mathetes. Now, in classical Greek, it denoted a learner, but the New Testament takes this and completely synthesizes it with the heavy, immersive Hebrew concept of an apprentice. Imagine a high-intensity, immersive internship where you are literally shadowing a master tradesman 24/7. The goal here isn't just passing a written test on theology. According to Luke chapter 6, verse 40, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Notice the objective there. The goal of this structural apprenticeship was a complete, ground-up replication of the master's character. The first-century apprentice lived in constant physical proximity to their rabbi. They adopted his entire life framework. You see, you were only considered fully trained when you essentially became a living, breathing copy of the master.
Now, the primary texts take this a massive step further. They completely fuse this identity of a mathetes with the identity of a doulos, a slave or bondservant. We really need to understand the gravity of this. In first-century Roman law, a doulos was the literal, legal property of the Lord, or kurios. This legal framework permanently ends any claim to self-determination. According to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. True discipleship means the individual possesses absolutely no independent rights, no autonomous agenda, and honestly, no personal time. Every single facet of your existence, your weekends, your bank account, your career goals, is legally and relationally transferred over to the ownership of the master. It is a total surrender.
To fully grasp how radical this is, we have to understand the massive shift from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant, the Old Covenant, was entirely external. Its laws were codified right there on tablets of stone. It was a performance-based system, governed by strict, rigid adherence to an external legal code. The New Covenant, however, fundamentally shifts where the law actually lives. According to prophetic texts like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, God performs this incredible internal surgical work, literally replacing a heart of stone with a heart of flesh. The law is now written on the internal tablets of the human heart. So what does this mean? It means obedience is no longer this forced external obligation driven by the terrifying fear of punishment. Instead, it becomes the natural, organic fruit of an indwelling Holy Spirit. It functions entirely on unconditional grace and direct, intimate relational access to the Master.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, surrendering personal autonomy.
This is exactly where the historical framework violently collides with our modern sensibilities. Let's take a look at this quote from the Apostle Paul. According to Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, "If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Paul establishes here that the New Covenant disciple operates under an incredibly strict binary mandate. Think about our modern world for a second. We are completely obsessed with social media optics, right? We crave peer validation. But a true disciple's primary validation must be entirely vertical, meaning Godward, and absolutely never horizontal or peerward. If you find yourself constantly calibrating your actions, tweaking your ethics, or watering down your message just to make it culturally palatable or to secure human approval, well, you are structurally violating that bondservant identity we just talked about. The fear of human disapproval literally has to be entirely replaced with a singular, consuming obsession with the master's validation.
So, here is the crucial point we really need to unpack. Human nature hates giving up control. We try to fight back against this total surrender, and we use a very specific, clever cognitive maneuver to preserve our own self-sovereignty. We adopt this highly defensive posture, and we ask, well, does the master's silence equal permission? I mean, he didn't explicitly say I couldn't do this specific thing, so it must be okay, right?
Let's dig deep into this in Section 3, the loophole fallacy.
Let's completely deconstruct this legalistic moralism of searching for technical permissibility rather than seeking actual true intimacy with the master. When a disciple utilizes the silence as permission argument, that it's not strictly forbidden mechanism, they are actually masking a profound, deep-seated agenda of autonomy. It is exactly akin to a corporate lawyer searching for loopholes in a contract. If you are only avoiding what is explicitly black and white forbidden just so that you can go ahead and fulfill your own self-interest or gain social approval, you have effectively demoted Jesus Christ from your master to a mere consultant. Now contrast this with true liberty. The mechanism here completely flips. It asks, what does the master want? The goal isn't self-interest anymore, it's faithful representation. In the New Covenant, true liberty is absolutely not the capacity to do whatever you want. It is the liberty to creatively and effectively execute his mission. And finally, we have restricted liberty. This is the highest, most rigorous level of spiritual maturity, where the mechanism asks, how can I protect my brother, even if I technically have the freedom to act? The autonomous, immature disciple is always asking, where's the rule that says I can't? But the mature disciple asks, does this actually look like Jesus?
So how does a true apprentice operate in those inevitable gray areas where there just isn't a direct, explicit command? First, and most importantly, they categorically reject the argument from silence. True disciples focus intensely on being exactly like the master. They do not sit around making excuses like, well, the master didn't say we couldn't. That is entirely the wrong framework. Instead, they actively cultivate what Paul calls the mind of Christ. They become so deeply, intimately acquainted with the master's character that they intuitively know how he would react in any given situation. Furthermore, they rely heavily on the Holy Spirit to inform their conscience, which acts as this incredible internal regulatory censor. When an action even feels like a slight departure from the master's character, the conscience creates dissonance. It acts as a real-time monitor of your alignment. Ultimately, the disciple takes an offensive posture. They act in good conscience to do their absolute best to assume the master's will based on his known ways and teachings. Think about it. If the master prioritized mercy, truth, and sacrificial love, the mature disciple automatically assumes any course of action reflecting those values is perfectly aligned with his will. They aren't just blindly guessing. They are acting as a faithful, fully aligned agent of the king.
This brings us to the ultimate defining test of this liberty. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 and 24, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. This directly addresses the weak brother dynamic that we also find outlined in Romans 14. A weak brother is someone whose conscience is currently hypersensitive. A truly mature disciple will voluntarily and gladly restrict their own true liberty just to protect that brother. If exercising your freedom causes another believer to stumble, the mature disciple instantly sacrifices their right to act. This proves, conclusively, that liberty in the New Covenant is a tool to serve the master and his household. It is never, ever a mechanism to escape him or simply serve yourself. But how does the outside world actually see all of this play out?
Let's explore that in Section 4, Evidentiary Proofs of Discipleship.
If personal autonomy is truly dead, and the disciple is now a living copy of the master, what are the actual operational signatures that visibly prove this to the unregenerate outside world? The primary, undeniable signature is agape. Now, this isn't just warm affection or casual friendship. Agape is a heavily volitional, sacrificial, and covenantal love that deliberately acts in the absolute best interest of the other person, completely regardless of the personal cost to yourself. According to Jesus in John chapter 13, verse 35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Notice the intense structural gravity here. Jesus doesn't say the world will know you are his disciples by your incredibly precise theology or your massive stadium gatherings or your political influence. Not at all. The ultimate authorized, undeniable empirical proof of discipleship is visible, sacrificial unity. If a community loudly claims to follow Christ but fundamentally lacks this observable, costly love for one another, the outside world literally lacks the evidentiary basis to recognize them as true disciples. It's that simple.
But to actually sustain that kind of radical, unnatural love, the disciple has to operate entirely on a mindset of deep, continuous dependence. They must adhere strictly to the abiding requirement, which is rooted in the Greek word meno, meaning to remain or to stay in a continuous, vital life link with Christ, the vine. This requires ceaseless relational calibration, which happens primarily through prayer, But we absolutely must reject the idea that God can somehow be manipulated by repetitive mechanics or sheer word count, like it's some kind of magical formula you can hack. According to Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 verse 7, we are explicitly told not to heap up empty phrases like the pagans do. Rather, according to James chapter 5 verse 16, the prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Notice that word righteous. It implies a disciple whose will is completely flawlessly synchronized with the Master. Prayer efficacy comes entirely from this righteous alignment with the Master's will, not from some clever linguistic trick or incantation.
And we need to be incredibly clear about the severe gravity of this alignment. Because the disciples' allegiance has been totally 100% transferred out of the world system, that autonomous system now views the disciple as a foreign body. It's like biology. It will inevitably react with systemic hostility, allergic rejection, and even institutional excommunication. According to the primary text, true discipleship acts as a highly disruptive dividing mechanism that can and will cause relational and even familial severance. The idea that faithful, uncompromising discipleship somehow yields societal respect or broad cultural favor, that is a total fabricated fallacy.
Jesus codifies this exact expectation directly for us. According to Matthew chapter 10 verse 25, it is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? For context, Beelzebul was a highly derisive term for a demonic entity. Jesus is explaining a deep, unavoidable structural reality here. Because the disciples' nature and actions perfectly replicate the master, they will inherently and unavoidably draw the exact same social cost, the same calculated character defamation, and even the physical peril that the master himself faced. A true disciple never, ever expects an easier path than the Master walked. In fact, they consider it a profound honor to simply share his lot.
Let's bring this all together in Section 5, Social Cost and Replication.
Let's honestly compare the historical reality with our comfortable modern assumptions. The first-century framework was an incredibly high-friction survival paradigm. According to Luke chapter 9, verse 23, it necessitated literal cross-bearing, which means a daily intentional walking toward your own death, to self-sovereignty. Now contrast that with our modern Western framework. Today, we so often operate under a therapeutic model of faith. We treat it as a low-friction consumer good that's designed primarily to just make us feel better about ourselves and our life choices. In this modern paradigm, personal autonomy is rigorously, aggressively preserved, and Christ is treated merely as an additive life consultant rather than the sovereign Lord of the universe. This structural degradation completely replaces the profound, life-altering cost of the bondservant identity with casual, convenient weekend affiliation.
To correct this massive error, we have to return to the actual four-step life cycle of a true disciple. Step 1 is regeneration. This is the internal pneumatic work of the Holy Spirit actually creating a brand new heart. Step 2 is imitation. This is the daily, often grueling apprenticeship of deliberately conforming one's entire character to the Master's. Step 3 is telic replication, or purposeful multiplication. A disciple is strictly mandated to multiply this exact structural obedience into other people. And finally, Step 4 is the eschatological audit. You see, discipleship is not merely about your own personal spiritual enrichment. It culminates in a very real, very strict final evaluation of your entire life.
Let's look a little closer at Step 3. Replication. There is a very common excuse floating around today that making disciples was a specialized mission strictly reserved for the original 12 apostles or maybe professional paid clergy. The text entirely refutes this apostolic exclusivity fallacy. According to the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 2, "And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." Look at that structure. Paul explicitly establishes a decentralized, multi-generational chain of custody. Paul gives it to Timothy, Timothy gives it to faithful men, and those faithful men give it to others also. Structural replication in teaching isn't optional, it is the expected, mandatory baseline for absolutely all mature believers across all generations.
And this naturally leads us to the ultimate reality check, the final audit. Just as a university student inevitably faces finals, or an employee faces a rigorous annual performance review, every single disciple will face a strict evaluation. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, often referred to as the Bema seat. Here, the Master will formally audit the disciples' managerial stewardship. How did you use your assigned time, your resources, the truth you were entrusted with? Because the disciple is the literal legal property of the master, the new covenant demands that you live absolutely every single moment, fully aware that you will present a final accounting to the sovereign Lord.
So let's summarize the full forensic profile of a true cruciform apprentice. A true New Covenant disciple requires a total, unmitigated transfer away from personal autonomy and self-sovereignty. It requires the active, evidence-based assumption of the master's character in every single gray area of life. No more looking for loopholes. It demands the visible, sacrificial love for the communal household that empirically proves your identity to the watching world. And finally, it requires a rock-solid commitment to multi-generational replication. Our audit concludes that any definition of discipleship lacking these fundamental pillars completely fails the evidentiary test of the primary texts.
So we arrive at the final provocative question. As you step out to navigate your life, your emerging career, and your faith, you face a stark binary choice. Will you remain a low-friction, autonomous consumer of information, continually looking for loopholes and asking, well, did the master explicitly say I couldn't do this? Or will you surrender entirely to the rigorous, totalizing, and ultimately glorious apprenticeship of the master, assuming his will, bearing his cross, and replicating his life? The dossier is clear, the evidence is on the table, the choice and the ultimate accounting of that choice is entirely yours.